Sarah Maza. I recently retired from the history department at Northwestern. I'm a specialist in European and more specifically French history. And I also I'm a specialist in theories and methods of history. And I wrote a book called Thinking About History. So these two sessions have been about some of the big questions. And last week, I talked about all of the different ways in which the approaches to history have changed over the last 50 years or so. And as promised, tonight I'm going to be talking about some of the debates and discussions and dissensions that occur both mostly within academic history, but then at the end I'll talk a little bit about how this spills over into the public sphere. I'm going to be talking for between 50 minutes and an hour, and I really look forward to your questions after I've done talking. So with that, I'm going to start talking about controversies in history. So I don't think many people think anymore that history is a science with right and wrong answers, or that historians will someday establish a settled truth about the past. But when history as a modern discipline was established, that's what many people thought. So before the 19th century, and again, I'm talking entirely about Europe and the United States. I have no expertise in areas outside of Euro-America, but talking about Euro-America, before the 19th century, historians were not professionals. They were men of letters. They were people who told stories about the past without any specific method. They were writers, people like Edward Gibbon or Voltaire, often attached to royal courts. But as modern universities got established in the later 19th century, practitioners of the discipline organized themselves into societies. That's when you got a history discipline with history methods. So you get the creation of, say, the Royal Historical Society in England in 1868, the American Historical Association in 1885, and other such organizations in other places with their flagship journals that still exists today: the English Historical Review, the American Historical Review, the Revue Historique. These are all later 19th century, between the 1860s and 1900. And this was very much linked to the rise of nationalism in the West and the need to train teachers and civil servants, and to this who would help perpetuate certain stories, who would absorb and perpetuate certain stories about the nation. And so science was at the height of its prestige in the late 19th century. And historians wanted to align their discipline with the hard sciences because that was the ideal. So it's in this period that actually the notion of quote unquote research became an important item in historical activity. And historians began to be obsessed with things like archives and sources. Besides the journals, there were lots of vast collections of sources that were published in this period, documents that were supposed to be the building blocks of the discipline. And the idea was that history was a science, and that with this research, you would establish a central, unarguable truth about the past. And in fact, that it was conceivable that once you'd done this, everyone could stop doing history. Here's what a French guide to historical studies published in 1898 said, quote, "History has at its disposal a limited stock of documents. This very circumstance limits the possible progress of historical science. When all the documents are known and have gone through the operations which fit them for use, the work of critical scholarship will be finished. So doing history was the process of adding stone by stone to the edifice of historical knowledge until it would be finished. So various versions of this persisted well into the 20th century, but it's safe to say that academic historians now broadly agree that history is a constantly evolving field and that it changes according to a variety of factors, including the historical context, the identities of historians, debates over methods and interpretation, and that some form of presentism is inevitable. There's a famous phrase, I don't know where it comes from, but it's that history is what the present needs to know about the past. So it's always determined by the present. And therefore, because the present constantly changes, history isn't static and it will never be done. So, what are the sorts of debates that have roiled the discipline? I'll talk about the academic discipline first, and then I'll move out to stuff that's more connected to the public sphere and some of things you have probably heard about. So, disputes in academia, as you can imagine, there are perennial generational tensions between old fogies and young Turks, with the older generation always convinced that the radical young folks are ruining the discipline. And I lived through several iterations of this. All the movements I talked about last week, social history, labor history, quantitative history, women's history, gender history, and so on. All of these were subject to this kind of debate. And older historians thought that, for instance, social history was ruining the discipline. Younger male Marxist historians thought that feminists working on women's history were doing trivial and apolitical work. And every historian believes that the sort of history they're doing is politically important work, but everyone has a different sense of politics. Um, my favorite old fogey moment that I came across while writing my book is the eminent historian Carl Breidenbau, who in his presidential address to the American Historical Association in 1962 thundered, quote, "The finest historians will not be those who worship at the shrine of the bitch goddess quantification." Well, quantification didn't last very long as a method in history, but so he wasn't entirely wrong, but I love the overheated rhetoric, and it's an example of what you hear generation after generation. It's not always generational. For instance, in the 1990s, there was a lot of antagonism in the field of women's and gender history, which was a quite new field, between tensions between gender historians. Remember last week I explained that gender history is a kind of more abstract approach that insists on the conceptual work of gender and the tension between maleness and femaleness that can, in an abstract way, govern lots of institutions. Well, so gender historians had a more abstract approach to gender, and historians of women who were social historians of women who were working on real women and their lives and their work and so on. And they were upset that the people who adopted the approach of gender history were ignoring and erasing real women in the past. So that's an example of very progressive people, members of the same generation, all of them progressive feminists, but in this case, who were bitterly divided over methods and approaches. So it's not always the older against the newer. There are many examples of tensions between historians of the same generation. So historical debate within academia takes many forms, and sometimes it takes place, it concerns such small differences and such arcane subjects that it looks like the sort of satire that the late novelist David Lodge used to write about. One of the probably the most notorious field in our discipline here in Euro-America for a long time was 17th century English history, because the debates over the English Revolution of the 1640s were incredibly nasty and personal over what seemed to be really arcane issues. There was a prolonged kerfuffle in the 1980s with many articles, vicious articles written about the role of Viscount Say and Seal in the House of Commons in 1647. Now, if you're in the field, that's linked to a big question, which is the role of the aristocracy in the English Revolution. But these people in the field of 17th century British history were lobbing bullets at each other in the nastiest of terms. And that was partly because it involved Oxbridge Dons fighting over a tiny patch of historical scholarship. But this field, 17th century Britain, was so explosive that some of them actually left Britain, and they settled in major universities in America, where they trained their graduate students to attack the graduate students of their enemies, and everybody had to take sides. You were either team R.H. Tawney or team Hugh Trevor Roper. And, it continued these debates migrated to America and continued to be incredibly nasty. The rest of us were scratching our heads about why these people were getting so excited about something that seemed very minute. In fact, it's had to do with the culture of Oxbridge Dons, which encourages more, at the time, encouraged more fighting. But it also is the case that the discipline of academic history was more fractious, was more internally fractious a few decades ago than it is now. A generation or two back, it was common, much more common than it is now, for people to make a career for themselves by attacking another scholar, ideally a very big person in the field. And it's less common now. This sort of practice of making your career by attacking the big guy in the field was very gendered. It was usually male scholars who did this. And I think that the fact that so many women have entered the discipline has really changed things. I mean, it's kind of comical because it evokes phrases like the civilizing influence of women. But I think it is true that there was a gendered culture of hunters as opposed to weavers, of going after the big game. And now approaches to history have become more pluralistic, more ironic, less fractious, although individual cases of people attacking each other for reasons of different politics, or for reasons of personal dislike, or for reasons of personal ambition still abound. So it's easy to laugh at the Oxbridge Dons, who were all, shooting at each other over small things that happened in the 1840s. But on the other hand, you can have conflicts over very profound issues, because two historians can look at exactly the same set of sources and come up with very different interpretations. for reasons that have to do with identity, with ideology, and so on. Um, One striking example that you may have heard of has to do with the history of the Holocaust and the records of Reserve Battalion 101, which was a company of German reservists who, in 1942 and 43, over the course of several months, carried out orders to round up and shoot around 38,000 Polish Jews. And we have extensive documentation of this episode because the survivors were questioned at length after the war. And in 1992, a distinguished American historian of the Holocaust, Christopher Browning, published a book about this episode entitled Ordinary Men, and it's become something of a classic. You may have encountered it or read it. And he wanted to explain, Browning wanted to explain why so many of these reservists had participated in this killing, despite the fact that the sources showed they were seemed to indicate that they weren't eager to kill Jews. They didn't enjoy it. They found it deeply disturbing. And they did it anyway, even though actually they were given the option to turn down the task and told that there would be no retribution if they refused to go along with it. And Browning, he does consider all of the many reasons why, but eventually he lays the accent on group psychology. He drew on classic experiments in group psychology, like the famous Milgram experiment, and he argued that ordinary men, and these were ordinary guys, only about a quarter of them were Nazi party members. They were working class, lower middle class men, many of whom were not, career military. That ordinary men can do monstrous things out of conformism, out of respect for authority, and out of fear of rejection by their peers. They really felt that if they refused to do this, they would be shirking their duty. So this explanation infuriated another scholar, a young political scientist at Harvard named Daniel Jonah Goldhagen, and he published his own book 4 years later entitled Hitler's Willing Executioners, in which he argued very explicitly against Browning, and based on the same sources, that the explanation for the conduct of this man was virulent, deep-seated anti-Semitism that was braided into German culture. His argument was, his book was about the depth and power of anti-Semitism in Germany. He emphasized aspects of the sources that Browning had downplayed, instances of these soldiers torturing and mocking their victims, urinating on them, and so on. And he also said that obviously they were going to have a certain narrative when they were questioned after the war to exculpate themselves, but in fact they were acting out a culture poisoned by anti-Semitism. Now, this debate was very high profile. It was covered in all the popular press. And Browning sort of won the debate. His book became a classic. He remained the respected historian in the field. But Goldhagen sold 150,000 copies of his book in the United States, and even more in Germany, where people sort of glommed onto the book as they were, in the midst of the process of atoning for, coming to terms with, and being fascinated by the Holocaust. So this is the kind of conflict that is sort of quintessential. It's, two people looking at the same kind of sources, the exact same sources, and arguing with each other. And it's also the sort of conflict that people can easily understand outside of the academy because it raises, some very profound and very understandable issues about psychology, prejudice, and so on. Inside the academy, things are usually more arcane, but it's certainly the case that the dynamic in most fields is driven by various degrees and forms of what's known as revisionism. Now, revisionism has become a bit of a dirty word precisely because it's become associated with challenging the reality of the Holocaust. But it actually means something more generic, which is the challenge to a widely accepted interpretation of historical events. So you have a constant process of a dynamic between what happens to be the orthodoxy at a certain moment versus revisionism, which is the challenge to that orthodoxy. There's no necessary ideological content to orthodoxy and revisionism. It's just a dynamic. And my own field, which is the field of the French Revolution, went through a classic instance of a revisionist revolution about 40 years ago. It may be the sharpest example in historiography of something that seems obvious being turned inside out. In this instance, with orthodoxy being on the left and revisionism on the right. So the classic narrative of the causes of the French Revolution was for a very long time derived from Marxism, and it's one that still is embraced widely out there because it makes a sort of intuitive sense. So the story, the orthodox interpretation, is that in 18th century France, 18th century France was dominated by and ruled by a reactionary monarchy and aristocracy. They experienced serious financial troubles because nobles were exempt from taxes. Nobles were privileged, as the phrase went at the time. But the country was modernizing, capitalism was developing, and with it, an increasingly wealthy bourgeoisie or middle class, which had increasing wealth, no access to power, and was resentful of the privileged class position of the aristocracy. So the revolution was essentially a social revolution, not a social revolution led by poor people. They participated, but it wasn't their revolution. They weren't leading it, but a social revolution by the middle classes to overthrow the aristocracy and monarchy and take control of the country by making it into a republic. So this makes perfect intuitive sense, and it did for ages. But actually, every aspect of this story can be and was challenged starting in the 1960s. And very often the evidence to challenge it was lying there in plain sight, but people didn't see it because they were so wedded to this to this classic way of seeing things. Actually, the monarchy and the aristocracy were not reactionary. They were among, for instance, the greatest patrons and protectors of the writers of the Enlightenment. They paid them and fussed over them. The monarchy engaged in progressive reform. So to say that they were reactionary is actually not true or only partly true. They were open to the new ideas of the Enlightenment. Yes, nobles were fiscally privileged, but so were many other non-noble groups in society. There were lots of people who were tax exempt, lots of groups that were tax exempt. It wasn't just a noble thing. in terms of, the bourgeois capitalist revolution, there was very little capitalism at the time. It was still overwhelmingly an agrarian economy with only some exceptions in marginal sectors. Many of the early leaders of the revolution were actually nobles, including actual members of the royal family, and so on. So, for a long generation, scholars in the field have toppled this argument, the classic scenario, and instead said it's not a social revolution. It wasn't a social revolution. It was a big crisis, but it came out of a systemic political and fiscal crisis. It had nothing to do with a rising middle class and a reactionary aristocracy. So that's a kind of classic example of an interpretation that makes sense until people start saying, well, let's take other aspects of what we know and arrange it into a different pattern. And we have a whole different interpretation, and that's where the battles begin. um, and it may seem arcane, but the truth is some of these broader debates among historians have big implications for national identities, and they spill over into the public sphere quite easily. The revisionist interpretation of the French Revolution was initiated by British and American scholars at first. And the French were initially very resistant to it because their view was that if you denied that the French Revolution was a social revolution, then you were minimizing the founding event of modern France. Now, since then, this all came to a head during the bicentennial in 1989. Things have calmed down, and the revisionist interpretation has become the new orthodoxy. That other countries and other topics have had similar struggles and similar patterns of orthodoxy and revisionism. Another field in which this happened was the history of the Cold War, which was initially viewed by historians, especially in this country, as the Cold War was a series of attacks by the USSR as it expanded into Eastern Europe and elsewhere. So Americans responding to Russian aggression. So in this case, you had a right-wing orthodoxy, and revisionism was on the left, as younger scholars argued that under the cover of protecting freedom, the United States was in fact the main aggressor in the Cold War, undermining left-wing governments and movements around the world. So, in the field of Cold War studies, which I don't know very well, but it's gone through several waves of interpretation and reinterpretation, and these, classic cases of an accepted scenario being flipped inside out. So there have always been debates over the interpretation of specific events, and they're especially loaded when they touch on central events in a nation's history. Um, but academic historians also disagree, sometimes vehemently, about the subjects that I talked about in last week, which is what you could call the philosophy of history or approaches to history. Um, One of the hottest points of contention has been ongoing for a long time and appears in a new guise in the article I included for this session about presentism. But the ongoing debate constantly revolves around question of objectivity versus ideology, or objectivity versus subjectivity in the technical sense. So from the late 19th century into the mid 20th century or later, many, probably most academic historians believed in an ideal of objectivity. And I mentioned the historian Peter Novick last session. He defined objectivity in his classic book about the objectivity debate. He defined it this way: um, a commitment to the reality of the past and to truth as a correspondence to that reality, a sharp separation between the knower and the known, between fact and value, and above all, between reality and fiction. So objectivity is a tricky question. It's easy to see why people were and still are attracted to the idea of historical objectivity or objectivity in historical studies. It is, again, one of these things that makes intuitive common sense. Surely we can all agree that this or that well-documented event in the past actually happened. We can all agree on a set of historical facts. The Battle of X happened on date Y and resulted in this side winning and that side losing. Although I should say that military historians explain that it's sometimes a lot less evident than you would think, unless it's a total wipeout. Sometimes who won a battle isn't so obvious. But anyway, there are facts there, right? But it's also easy to see how this can be challenged, because maybe a fact is a fact, but facts in themselves don't have meaning. They only have meaning when they are arranged into patterns and stories. And how you tell that story, and in fact, what story you choose to tell, are heavily determined by the identity of the teller. And here we go back to something I mentioned last week, um, which is that until the later 20th century, the history profession was really homogeneous. And it's much easier for a group of people to believe in objectivity when they share the same background and perspective. For instance, I am convinced that it's an objective fact that COVID vaccines save lives. But I'm probably convinced that this is an objective fact because I only ever talk to people who believed the same thing. If I was very close to and talked to people who disagreed, I might not think this is an objective fact. With the increasing diversification of the history profession, in terms of class, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of gender, in terms of race, it was inevitable that the idea of historical objectivity would fall on hard times. So there have been, and there still are, rancorous debates in the profession, and the presentism debate is just one spin on it, between people who embrace subjectivity as a political stance by saying something like, I see the past differently than you do because I'm a woman of color, and people who respond, well, if you embrace subjectivity, we might as well trash the whole discipline because every individual will have a different story. So what's the point of doing history? The best answer to this debate, the best compromise position that I know of, and I think it's one that many historians adopt either explicitly or implicitly, is the one laid out in a book entitled Telling the Truth About History by the historians Joyce Appleby, Lynn Hunt, and Margaret Jacob. It was published in 1994. And their argument is that, yes, we have to recognize that objectivity is a myth because we're all situated in time and space and bodies. And so we never have a neutral approach to information. What we know is always shaped by who we are. On the other hand, that doesn't mean, the corollary is not that anything goes and anyone can write history as they damn well please because historians are a collectivity. And we agree to be bound by certain rules. We have rules as a community of knowledge about how we get information, how we document what we say, what's plausible, what's persuasive, and so on. So just because objectivity is a myth, you can't say the Holocaust never happened, or you can't say George Washington was actually transgender, because you're part of a broad conversation among people who agree on the rules of the game. So it's kind of a practical answer to a theoretical conundrum. And so that's the answer to, well, if it's not objective, we might as well throw it all out. We collectively lean towards something we would like to, an ideal of truth, even if we admit that we can never really attain it. So the argument that, you know, if you don't embrace objectivity, you might as well not do history, is, well, the best response I know of was formulated by the famous historian, the anthropologist, not historian, Clifford Geertz. And the way he put it was, just because a perfectly antiseptic environment is impossible doesn't mean that you should conduct surgery in a sewer. So debates about objectivity and subjectivity were particularly intense in the 1980s and 1990s because they dovetailed with a broader crisis in the humanities around what's known most broadly as postmodernism. The new approaches to things like gender and sexuality that I mentioned last time drew inspiration from approaches like post-structuralism that were devoted to stressing the ways in which meaning is culturally constructed. Uh, for reasons too complicated to go in, the most radical trends in the humanities shifted in the 1980s from the most radical stance being Marxist materialism to the most radical stance being a kind of cultural relativism. The way to challenge dominant orthodoxy via historical work changed from class analysis to a kind of radical relativism via something that became known as cultural constructivism. This had to do with the ascendancy of cultural history and the argument that everything is culturally constructed. And most of this was so the idea was that if you look at the past and show the ways in which things like sex and gender and race and everything was understood radically differently in the past, you juxtapose this with the present and you show how arbitrary and contingent meaning is in the present day. This produced a lot of very fine scholarship and important insights. It was a revelation, for instance, when scholars started to point out that race isn't a biological fact, that, you know, race isn't that you're black, white, yellow, or red, but race is historically constructed and it's endlessly shifting. Why, for instance, were people in the United States who looked somewhat or completely white considered black if they even had a shred of black ancestry? Or why, again, in the United States, where, you know, all of this scholarship on race first came from, why were the Irish and the Jews considered non-white in the 19th century, and how did they, quote unquote, become white? So conservative historians were appalled because this seemed really nihilistic, and they were constantly arguing things like, well, how can you say that? For instance, being sick or being healthy, those are physical facts, and they're not culturally constructed. You know, if you're throwing up, you're throwing up. That's not a cultural construction. But then, of course, it's easy to show that, you know, you may be throwing up, but medical diagnoses, the way that is understood, and treated is something that is entirely culturally constructed. So even if something has a base in physical reality, its social meaning is entirely variable. But this was a hugely, sort of heated and visceral debate in the 1990s. Um, Again, it was explosive because it seemed to cut the ground out from under things like facts and reality. You are challenging facts, you are challenging reality. And conservative historians were alarmed by these postmodern approaches because philosophically, they seem to challenge the idea of a solid reality out there. If everything is a cultural construction, if there aren't any solid facts out there, then just shreds of information that we string together arbitrarily, we might as well be writing fiction. Um, and 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 I should say parenthetically that conservative historians were angered by this, but Marxist historians no less. They thought this was a betrayal of the realities of an injustice, exploitation, hardship that people suffered in the past. If you say it's all cultural construction, you are basically dismissing actual suffering and actual oppression. So people who adopted this cultural relativist line were getting attacked from the left and from the right. At the time when the postmodern it's all a construction phase was at its highest, it touched off these furious responses from scholars like the Holocaust scholar Richard Evans. Holocaust scholars were particularly incensed by this. They said, well, Auschwitz is not a cultural construction. And Evans wrote a whole book in which he argued that postmodern scholars were, quote, barbarians at the disciplinary gates, loitering there with distinctly hostile intents, unquote. So postmodernism was explosive in historical studies, especially because it touched on a very sensitive issue, and one that, again, continues to nourish debates in the academy, which is the line between fact and fiction. So on the face of it, and this came up briefly last week when we were talking, on the face of it, the line between history and fiction is easy to draw. It should be a bright line. It should be hard and fast. Novelists can make stuff up. Historians cannot. Even when, a historical novelist, and I keep mentioning Hilary Mantel because she's considered the finest historical novelist of our age. She writes superbly documented novels based entirely on impeccable historical information, but she can imagine what's going on inside the heads of her characters. And a historian using the same sources theoretically can't do that. Historians, as I mentioned last week, don't typically have access to the psyches of their characters. But it's not quite that simple. All historians actually invent stuff. And at its most anodyne, it's the process of adding something like a touch of color. If I write, and I've written stuff like this, on a frigid morning in January of 1759, a young peasant woman walked on the road to Paris. Well, I'm writing that, and I haven't actually gone looking for the weather report. I'm just guessing that it was cold in January around Paris. Safe bet there wasn't a heat wave. And the detail makes it just a little bit more reader friendly. And historians do stuff like that all the time. They add touches of invention that connect the dots between sources. Um, but sometimes the speculation is central to the argument, and this can become very controversial. And again, it connects with this moment of skeptical relativism that connecting to postmodernism. The most famous example of a debate around, what can and cannot be invented, is a book you may have heard of because it was also the basis for a very famous movie, The Return of Martin Guerre, was published, I think it's 1984, by a very much admired and beloved historian, the late Natalie Zemon Davis. And the book is another example of the kind of, it's one of those classic microhistories that I mentioned last time. It's about the famous case of a 16th century peasant in southwestern France, a man named Martin Guerre, who was married very young. And then for various reasons, because of disputes with his father, after he was married not very long, ran off from his village and went off to fight in the Spanish army. And many years later, he returned and was welcomed home by his wife, with whom he lived seemingly happily for several years, until some of the villagers became unhappy with him and began to insist that he wasn't the real Martin Guerre. So eventually, there was a trial. He was put on trial. And in a surprise twist, which is why it made such a great book and such a great movie, in the middle of the trial, the real Martin Guerre did come back in the midst of the proceedings, and the other guy was revealed to be an imposter, and he was executed. So everyone at the time and until Davis seems to have assumed that the wife was indeed fooled into believing that this man was her husband. It seems weird to us, but it's a really interesting case for thinking about how we base our identities at a time before people had mirrors and photographs and so on. You may have had a very different idea. An identity possibly was determined by who you were in your social world rather than this sense of a very unique individual identity. Anyway, that was an interesting sub-theme. So people assumed that she, the wife, believed this was her husband until her actual husband came back. But Natalie Davis chose to read this case differently. She argued that the wife was, in fact, a very clever woman who knew that the man who came back wasn't her husband, but they agreed to pretend that he was. They agreed either explicitly or implicitly to pretend that he was, because it was to both of their advantages and because they seemed to have liked each other and had possibly fallen in love. So it's a sort of feminist love story that gives the wife agency. Now, Natalie Davis was a very careful historian. It's beautifully documented, all the local archives and so on. But she uses the gaps in the story to connect the dots differently by imagining a different story than was originally told. And as she puts it in the introduction, in a phrase that is often cited, what I offer you here is in part my invention, but held tightly in check by the voices of the past. And her approach is to say, here are the facts, here's what we know, and there are many possible stories, and I'm only giving you one version of the story. And that's the kind of thing that doesn't sit well with more conservative historians, where the idea is we're all sort of trying to establish some commonly understood, some commonly accepted truth, and to say, well, there are many stories, this is just one of them, is kind of shocking. And the book has remained a classic, but it's also been fodder for debate. How much is a historian allowed to write, she must have thought, they might have agreed, perhaps she did this, perhaps she thought this, and so on. In other words, how much connecting the dots with speculations about people's motives is allowable before you cross from history into fiction. Historians have always done it, but it's a question of degree. So I've talked a lot about debates among academic historians, and I want to spend a few minutes finally just expanding into the public sphere, where various kinds of disputes also arise, in most cases as extensions of academic trends as they hit the public sphere. I'm sure you're all perfectly familiar with these as they are unfolding right now in real time. Debates around the K-12 school curriculum are fierce, and honestly, they're frightening right now, but they're also a worse version of what we have seen several times before. If you may remember that in the 1990s, at the beginning of the Clinton administration, there was a fierce ruckus led by Lynn Cheney over the privileging of women and minorities in school curricula, and the same sorts of objections to what was considered a negative and unpatriotic framing of the national past. And it's not just in the United States. There have been history wars over school curricula in many other countries, in Britain, in France, in Australia, in South Africa, and so on. And it's always the same, you people are criticizing our national history and it's demoralizing and wrong, and so on. And you see the same sort of tension between critical and celebratory history in the occasional flare up around history museums. Some of you may remember the fracas in the early to mid 1990s over the Enola Gay exhibit at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. The curators of that museum had decided to exhibit the B-29 that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, along with exhibits that graphically showed the devastation that it caused in the Japanese population. And the blueprint for that exhibition circulated before the exhibit, and it integrated academic debates. Did the US ignore Japanese peace initiatives? Would Americans have dropped this sort of bomb onto a German city, and so on? And veterans groups got a hold of these blueprints, and they were incensed by what they saw as an insult to the memory of American troops, believing that the bomb had saved countless American lives, their own lives and those of their brethren, and that the exhibit was making light of that and insulting the memory of those who had served in the Pacific. And it all became a rather fierce political debate. Conservative members of Congress put a lot of pressure on the museum, and eventually the secretary of the Smithsonian canceled the exhibit, and the director of the museum was hounded out of his position. He had to resign. But what you're seeing here is a similar instance of progressive and critical politics of the academy coming up against the celebratory politics of a wing of the political establishment. And tensions are particularly acute right now because of conservative attacks on the over-educated, quote unquote, elite. Never mind that people like Elise Stefanik and J.D. Vance are Ivy League graduates themselves. But it is the case that people who produce public history in its various guises, museums, school curricula, and so on, typically are the product of higher education, so they tend to lean towards progressive scripts, and then they become ripe targets for the right. And I surely don't have to point out that this is all, of course, happening now because we live in a time of heightened ideological tension, and history has become centrally embroiled in ideological controversy. As with all history wars, it's hard to tell who fired the first shot, but you can probably draw a straightish line from the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, and the publication in the New York Times 5 years later of the so-called 1619 report. This was a series of essays aiming, as the preamble put it, quote, to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the center of our national narrative. So the date 1619 is significant, and of course it was 2019 was the 400th anniversary, and it was flagged as the date that the first slaving ship arrived in North America. The 1619 project wasn't a conventional history. It was a set of essays on the history of various inequalities, racial inequalities in wealth, health, housing, and so on, all explained with reference to the original sin of slavery. And the project's director, Nicole Hannah-Jones, is not a historian, but a journalist. And while she asked historians for input, the essays were also mostly written, not entirely, but mostly written by journalists. And it was a large project. It wasn't just these essays, but books and podcasts and a special curriculum for schools. And all this became a flashpoint in ways that you can imagine. But meanwhile, the right has been on its own crusade to claim its own historical point of origin. In his first term, Donald Trump established a 1776 advisory commission in preparation for the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence next year. And that commission has already published its report, which you can find online, and it makes interesting reading. It's actually very short. Essentially, it's dedicated to repudiating identity politics by insisting that the essence of America is colorblind universalism. But it's not like French universalism, with which, I'm very familiar, because it also involves great dollops of religious faith. For instance, to give you a sense of what's in the 1776 report, Chapter 4 is organized in short sections addressing what the authors call challenges to America's principles, and those challenges include those challenges are slavery, progressivism, so the progressive movement of the late 19th century, fascism, communism, and the last item is racism and identity politics. So identity politics are the same thing as racism. And here's a quote. In portraying America as racist and white supremacists, identity politics advocates follow Lincoln's great rival, Stephen Douglas, who wrongly claimed that the American government was made on the white basis by white men for the benefit of white men. Indeed, there are uncanny similarities between 21st century activists of identity politics and 19th century apologists for slavery. So we have these dueling documents, both of them highly ideological, both of them marred with historical inaccuracies. The 1776 Commission report argues vigorously, for instance, that faith and revelation were just as important as reason in the founding principles of America, which I think would have come as a big surprise to many of the founding fathers. But the 1619 project has been exposed for some real howlers as well, not just by conservatives. The most prominent critics of the 1619 report are, Democrats, historians who are Democrats. Gordon Wood, Sean Wilentz, James Oakes, these are prominent American historians, sort of center-left. And they have publicly criticized many inaccuracies in the report. And my colleague at Northwestern, Leslie Harris, who is an African-American scholar who is very squarely left-wing, was one of the advisors on the project, but they ignored her input and they argued against her advice that the American Revolution was carried out in order to protect slavery, which was imperiled by British abolitionists in the 18th century, notwithstanding the fact that there wasn't really an abolitionist movement in Britain in the 18th century. So their argument, the 1619 argues that the colonies split from Britain to protect slavery. And my colleague Harris has publicly repudiated this argument, and just about every academic historian of the period says it's nonsense. So this gets us back to questions about ideology and objectivity that I discuss in the piece that I sent out. And you don't have to have read it. We can discuss this. In this time of high ideological tension, there are people on the left and on the right who are all too willing to distort the past in order to weaponize it. And that's what's meant by not presentism, because presentism is fine, but the abuse of presentism. And it's very tempting to respond by invoking the need for factual accuracy. And there's a great deal to be said for invoking just the facts at a time when facts have taken such a beating, fake news and so on. But the central point I want to make in that piece is that both sides in this debate lose sight of what I think is most important about history, which is that it's an intellectually creative discipline, especially when it pushes back against the orthodoxies of both the right and the left. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm really looking forward to your questions.